It's official. The time has come, and our 240,000 kilometer 2011 Jaguar XFR is about to get its heart ripped out. This thing may be bone stock still, but damn, she sounds good. If you are new here, thank you for joining along, and here sits one of my two black 2011 Jaguar XFRs. About 6 months ago, I bought the other one with 140,000 kilometers, force-fed it about 700 horsepower, and then managed to absolutely smoke a coyote with it. In the last episode, we bought this one here as a solution to our problem, and it is also a 2011 black car, but this one has about 240,000 kilometers instead. We paid $6,800 for this thing, which is an absolute steal considering it is happy, healthy, dealer maintained its whole life, bone stock, and doesn't need anything. But of course, rather than just enjoy the thing, we are going to rip it apart and try and make it way better. We contemplated using the other chassis or using this one as the base to build upon, but I think we've decided we will end up using this chassis because it has had such an easy life. Everything's in great shape, we wouldn't have to replace a windshield, we wouldn't have to go through a salvage inspection, and everything associated with all those problems. I actually posted the engine from this one for sale because no matter what, I knew we weren't going to be using it. We have a beautiful, happy, healthy 140,000 kilometer engine with a ton of recent maintenance that we would be using regardless of which chassis we used. There is somebody coming to pick up this engine, and that guy has got a white facelift XFR that we almost just traded this one for instead. It only had 120,000 kilometers, but it's got a blown engine. Unfortunately for us, the guy did not want to go for it. He thought about it for a few days and just decided he would rather buy this engine and put it in that car. And now it is time to get this engine yanked out so we can start putting this thing back together better than it's ever been. Before we dive on in, I just wanted to take a second to thank you guys for your patience, as I've only been uploading about one video a week, and that is going to continue to increase and change as we go along. I've been putting a ton of work in the shop, getting this space all set up to be much more useful and much more visually appealing, and we're slowly getting there. I've moved the shelving from this side to that side, cleared out a whole bunch of stuff, painted and sheeted the walls. I've still got to do the roof, but we're getting there, and it is a much more functional and useful space, and I'm super stoked for it. I'm going to continue to upload as much stuff as I can, as quick as I can here on the Jags, the M6, and a whole bunch more to come. Before I get going too much here, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and in the comments below, I'd really like your guys' help. What color scheme do you think we should go with on this car? I've got a plan for the V10 M6. I know what color scheme I'd like to go with on that, but I'm not sure for the XFR. We will be doing a full color change wrap. I'm not a huge fan of black cars, and it just looks a little bit too much like regular traffic as it sits, but I'm not sure what color scheme we should go with. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to help me make a decision with the color scheme for the XFR, but without further ado, let's get the engine out from under that hood. I find this incredibly ironic, but the first step in our process, we gotta get this thing up on jack stands and pull off the front bumper, headlights, and all the front clip stuff that we worked so hard and went all over the country to track down. Generally speaking, European cars like this are known to be horrendous to work on, but thus far, I haven't found the XFRs to be that bad. Unlike the BMWs, the Jaguar has 3 lift points along the side skirts, which make it easy to get up, and getting the front bumper cover off only took a matter of minutes because it was only about 6 different bolts. Unfortunately on these cars, the headlight tabs are notoriously fragile, but the headlights are easy to remove. There's only 2 bolts that hold on the washer jet and 3 bolts that secure the headlight to the car with 1 electrical connection. After that, we pulled the intakes, which is just a few different pop clips, a couple of bolts, and a handful of clamps, and we were ready to dive deeper into the disassembly. We are making along absolutely swimmingly. We've got most of the front clip stuff pulled off. Of course, we have got our front bumper cover and our under tray pulled off, the engine cover, the full intake setup, the top rad tray, and the headlights, and we're starting to look pretty bare. We've still got a ways to go, and the next thing on the list is gonna be get the radiator drained and get the full rad pack out. The intercooler, the AC condenser, the radiator, the fans, all of that is in our way to access the front of the engine, along with, of course, our crash bar and the upper support bar as well. We're gonna get that all removed and out of our way. We have also found our first broken part being this air guide here that seals up against the bottom of the bumper. It's not a huge deal either way, but hopefully the one on the other car is good. I can't remember or not, but fingers crossed. Also, random side note, we may be using this hood. We will definitely not be using this hood insulation. That is absolutely gross. We've already actually pulled it on the other car because we don't need it. It's just there to hide some sound. These direct injected engines run pretty loud. You get a bit of rhythmic click from the injectors, along with the stock sprung supercharger coupler and a handful of other things that make this thing run super quiet as a luxury car. But of course, we're not about that. We want to hear the blower whine anyhow, so we'll get that thing pulled before this gets back on the road. Let's keep on trucking with this disassembly. From here onward is where we started to get into uncharted territory. With the previous Jag, when I did all the modifications, I had it apart to this degree, but I've never had one of these cars apart further than this. But there's a first time for everything, and I think it went quite well. There's some electrical connections on the lower crash bar for the park assist sensors, along with lines that feed the washer jets with washer fluid, and that was about it before we could get that thing unbolted. The upper support was slightly more difficult with the placement of some of the bolts, but all we had to do was unbolt the hood latches, get some bolts out of the way, and that thing was ready to come out and give us better access to the engine bay. Not only do we have the bumper, the headlights, the intakes, and all of that pulled off, we've also got the 2 crash bars, the air guide, and by we, I mean me and Willow. Next step in the process is going to be get all of the cooling stuff pulled off here. We'll get the intercooler pulled off, the rad fan pulled off, the radiator itself, and hopefully we'll be able to keep the AC condenser on the car. I'm sure you've noticed all of my nice little green flags. Whenever you're pulling an engine bay apart like this, it is always smart to label everything. Even if you think it's going to seem little and stupid, it makes life so much easier. We've done that. We've also labeled all of our bags with every bit of hardware we've pulled off the car. So when we go to put this thing back together, it is going to be so much easier and way less of a pain in the rear end. Some guys say you should separate it from the transmission and pull the transmission first or the engine first. But the other option that I think we're gonna try and do is pull the full powertrain as one. We should be able to just unbolt the 4 corners of the subframe, unbolt the exhaust and the drive shaft, disconnect any lines and electrical, and basically just set the whole thing down on the floor onto blocks and jack stands. Take the front of the car, pick it up with the engine crane, set the rear end down, and walk it backwards off of the powertrain pallet. And at that point, it makes it a lot easier. We'll be able to separate the engine from the transmission as we need to because there is somebody coming to buy it, but it will be much, much easier. We'll be able to see everything, look at everything as we're working around it, and we need the transmission out of the car anyhow. But I'm gonna get back to work. Let's get the full cooling pack pulled apart. With the radiator previously drained, we only made a little bit of a mess because most of the fluid had already been vacated from the system, but all we had to do to get the intercooler off was pop off a couple of hoses, undo a couple of bolts, and it came right off. The radiator and rad fans weren't too much different, basically just sitting in a groove and channel with one electrical connection to the fans to pop that out, and then the rad slid right on out of our way. And just like that, with a puddle of coolant and a pile of gross foam blocks, we've got our radiator fan, our intercooler, and everything all pulled. The AC condenser along with the power steering cooler are still on the car here. I'm not sure exactly what we'll do with that yet, if those 2 things will stay on, get pulled off, one of each. I'm not too sure. We're gonna have to figure that out. But the next steps in the process, we're gonna have to pull the wiper cowl. We will get this bracketry around the fuse box pulled. We'll get the rad reservoir pulled so we can get a better look at what we're getting into and what all needs disconnected before we can start yanking this engine. Well, color me impressed. We're doing pretty good. We have got our strut brace removed that sits underneath the wiper cowl. Of course, we've got the wiper cowl removed. There's actually a secondary wiper cowl, and that's this guy right here that sits below the main one. Got that out of the way. We got the fuse box surround out of the way, which if we take a peek over here, it's covered in insulation and whatever else. Got that out of our way. There's this bracketry and that plastic stuff right there. Covers our intake for the HVAC system. We can see right there, we very badly need a new cabin air filter, but that's okay, that's fairly easy. We've disconnected the engine side of the ECU plugs. So obviously our ECU is sitting right here. That goes to the body harness. This goes to our engine harness. There's a secondary plug as well that goes in right there for our engine harness. And best of my knowledge, that's all I'm seeing for connections from the engine harness to the body. But I guess we'll find out as we get lowering things and keep separating things. We're gonna have to disconnect the lines into the firewall here. There's 2 heater lines that are kind of hard to see, but we can see the 2 90s right there and right there. And if we trace those, one of them loops around and goes to this connection right there. The other one goes to this connection right there. We'll leave the hard lines on the chassis. We can disconnect the hoses and they'll stay with the engine. This is my first time pulling apart a Jaguar like this, but I think we are doing pretty good. I've still got yet to figure out, I'm pretty sure that's our 2 fuel line connections, our feed and our return right there. And we'll have to disconnect those and bag and zip tie the bags on. Beyond that, all we're gonna do to drop the subframe on the suspension side of things is we will just disconnect our upper control arm from our knuckle right there. We'll have to undo these 4 nuts and disconnect this electrical line because this is an active suspension system, so we'll have to disconnect the electronics on that side of things. We still for sure have to disconnect that suspension stuff, the exhaust, and the drive shaft, as well as our subframe bolts and our transmission mount bolts. I'm not sure. I think the power steering will be able to stay complete with the powertrain pallet here. It should just be 1 bolt that disconnects the steering shaft from everything else, and the power steering pump, and power steering cooler can just stay with the engine, and we can deal with that once the engine is out of the car. Beyond that, I'm not too sure. I don't exactly know what adversity we're gonna come across in trying to get this thing dropped. Hopefully it's not too bad, but of course we'll be finding out soon enough here. It's probably not gonna look like much is different, but we're making very good progress. Got the downpipes out. I actually pulled the fender liners as well. I'd already pulled some of the bolts earlier, and it was way easier to get everything out of the way with the fender liners out. Downpipes are out, bolts were kind of rusty, but we did get them out and it wasn't too bad. As far as the suspension goes, we are pretty much set and disconnected. I've got the knuckle disconnected from the upper control arm, and I've got the knuckle zip tied to the strut because the strut will come down with. I've got the brake caliper zip tied up in the corner because that will stay with the chassis and all the brake lines will stay connected. The only thing left to disconnect on both sides is just the nuts on top of the suspension and the electronics on top of the suspension as well. And that is all ready to drop down. Popped out the bolt for the power steering rack as well. We take a peek, you can see right there, got that bolt out. I've just got to get that knocked off the top. We've got to disconnect the rear drive shaft, and it's a good thing we're doing this now because looking at the Rotaflex on the drive shaft on this, it is done. All it is a rubber connection between the transmission and the drive shaft. So you have 6 bolts, 3 that bolt the Rotaflex to the drive shaft and 3 that bolt the Rotaflex to the transmission. And it acts as a rubber dampener between the two, and they're known to wear out. The one in our other Jag was replaced just before we got it. This one looks really crusty, cracked, and gross. So it's a good thing this thing's coming out now because that looks like it's very soon to fail. Also, another tidbit that is a very late update as I'm going along. These wheels are not going to stick with us. There is somebody that has made a good offer to buy these, and I've actually found a set of proper forged wheels for this car that are a very good deal. There's a guy who had an XFRS and he's got a bunch of goodies, and we're probably gonna go pick up the whole lot of them. So these will probably be leaving as well. And we will have a different wheel setup coming soon to the Jag. Slow and steady wins the race, and we are slowly getting there. We've got the drive shaft disconnected underneath here. You can see the transmission is dropped down a bit because I have lowered it with the jack. I've removed the mount. I had to remove the mount in order to get the Rotaflex and the drive shaft disconnected from each other. So that part is all done. We've disconnected the fuel lines here. We've gone around and disconnected a couple other things like the active suspension height sensors and a couple other battery cables and lines such as these here. This is a ground that goes to bell housing, and this goes to the alternator and the starter. Engine is not quite out yet, but I have to get going this evening here. I've sold a couple of parts off this thing because obviously we do have lots of good parts between the 2 cars combined, and I actually found somebody local who's selling a whole bunch of other stuff that will mean some more upgrades for our XFR, and means there's some more stuff I can sell from this car. We are on our way to meet somebody for the wheels. He's also taking a couple other things, and I have found another beautiful set of wheels that I can't wait to show you guys after we pick them up. So I'm gonna let you guys go. It'll be 2 seconds for you, and it'll be a hot minute for me, but I'll join you guys again tomorrow morning. We are back in the shop, and it is time to finish getting this engine removed. Isn't that right, girls? Where we left things last night, we had started to drop things. 1 of the 4 subframe bolts has already been removed, 2 have been loosened, and the 3rd has been loosened a touch and is giving us major problems. We've got the transmission supported with the jack stand, and we've got the front of the subframe supported by our floor jack, even though it doesn't really need to be yet. It is more of a precaution, but the 2 front bolts have been loosened and are pretty easy. They're secured by this round nut that is affixed to the frame rails here and here. And those ones weren't too bad. We loosened those off, and those are both still in and holding. The back is where our problems lie. If we take a peek, this is one of the back subframe bolts. I've pulled it completely out from that side, and it came out not too bad. But as you can see, they're round collars and they don't affix very well. And up front, it's not too bad where things are nice and clean. But if we take a peek over here, these aren't as good. There's a cavity that sits in here behind the suspension, and that round collar sits right in there for the bolt to go through. Unfortunately, what that means for us is a car like this, stuff collects in there, you get rocks, grime, debris from the road, and that bolt doesn't have an easy life. And to be completely honest, I'm very surprised. They're not in that bad a shape. Like if we take a peek at this bolt here, the top of the bolt doesn't really have much for corrosion or crap. The middle does a little bit, but it's just surface and it's not too bad. But the top is cleaner than I thought. The only problem, on that side, it came right out clean like it was supposed to. On this side, the collar is just spinning inside there. I tried last night before I left to get some vice grips or something on that collar to hold it, because the bolt did loosen off with the impact, but as soon as it loosened off a little bit, it just started spinning that collar, or the nut, whatever you want to call it, in place. We can't really go any further until that is loosened off, so I'm gonna do some more creative things. I might have to pull that coilover off, but I'm about to figure that out here, and I'll jump right back at you with a problem solved. I would be lying to you if I told you that took the amount of time I thought it would, but we have finally got it. This little guy right here, let's see, it had disconnected, and for whatever reason, it actually loosened off. Like there was no tension on it vertically, but for whatever reason, it did not want to thread off. And I don't really see anything too bad in the threads. Like it doesn't really make sense. The threads aren't super corroded. It's not super gross. I've had less issue with way grosser bolts. But I mean, hey, eventually we got it. There's a couple holes that sit around this plate, or that sit underneath this plate in ideal positions. I was able to put screwdrivers in them so it had something to bind up against because the tabs were broken. And then I still grabbed it with vice grips, and even then we barely got it, but we did get it. It was a little sketchy, but it is out of there now. So I'm going to set you guys up, and we are going to finally start working this engine out of the car. With the end near in sight, we had a couple more things to deal with before we could drop the engine out of the car. I'm just zip tying the power steering reservoir to the engine because the full power steering assembly stayed with the engine when we pulled it out of the car. After that, I got some of the AC lines out of the way as we weren't able to leave the AC connected, and then we got to lowering the engine. Not too quickly though, as before we got into it too far, some of my favorite distractions came to give me a visit. Getting back to it, the rest of the process wasn't too bad, but it definitely went by pretty slow. Removing an engine in this manner is not something you want to rush, as it is just a game of slowly taking one point a little bit down at a time, followed by the next point and the next point and the next point, all the way until you have it on the ground. We also had to ensure that the transmission stayed supported throughout this process and make sure that we didn't hurt or pull on any lines, electrical connections, or anything else while we were getting it lowered. Once we were able to ensure that there was nothing still connecting the engine to the chassis of the car, the process was able to speed up quite a bit. That being said, it was still important to employ a high degree of caution and care. The engine and transmission combination is very heavy, we didn't want to drop it on anything, and the engine mounts on this car are somewhat floating, so the subframe and the engine had quite a bit of room to rock on top of each other, which meant it was not super solid as we lowered it to the ground. Once we had the engine solidly set down on our blocks and our dollies, all that we had to do was get the suspension rocked out of the way on the two sides so it didn't hit the fenders, lift up the chassis of the car a little bit, and wheel the complete powertrain pallet out from underneath. Don't let anybody tell you as a backyard mechanic that you can't defeat a temperamental European car with a little bit of patience. This right here is my kind of win, and I absolutely love it. When I've done this in the past, what I've done is I've set this down on blocks, jack stands, whatever else, and then usually via the crash bar or the frame rails, use my engine crane, pick it up, and wheel it off the back. You'd have to get the back wheels back on and set it on the ground to do so, and I'm pretty sure that would have worked. The front end of this car is extremely light. I lifted it up a few minutes ago here so that we could get the engine underneath, and I was going to lift it and put it on blocks, but when I started to lift it, it lifted the whole front end of the car because the rear is much, much heavier right now than the front is with nothing mounted to it. So it ended up being even easier than we thought. It was a lot of slowly working it down, but eventually we did get it set down on blocks on the dollies, which we stole from under the M6, and here it is, right in front of us, completely out of the engine bay. And with that, that gets us to the end of the video. Thank you guys so much for joining along. Hopefully you enjoyed some time in the freshly renovated shop space. There's a lot of cool stuff coming, so make sure you stay tuned. Thank you for joining along. Have yourselves a wonderful day. We'll catch you next time.